Okay. So I think it should be recording now. Do we have, is it recording? Yes. Did everybody get a message for recording? Yes. Okay, good. So I've just backed up to the intro screen. Sorry, we had a bit of delay for those who are not seeing this live. Uh, our host, we did not have a host, so we had to switch rooms. So I've just talked about some of the premise to this presentation, which is largely going to be based on a systematic review that I and a couple students did. But that said, let me give you the general outline here, which is I'm going to define what human-animal interactions are, as well as animal-visitor interactions, and then I'll be using these acronyms pretty generally after defining those. I'm going to talk about data in reference to the systematic review itself. So that's our empirical assessment of growth, how things have changed in zoos in terms of the study of human-animal interactions. And then where do we go from here? What's the next step? Where should research start focusing as well as practice? And as I mentioned before hitting the recording, Sally Sherwin and I just had our book published with multiple authors, 15 chapters. I'll show an advert at the end of that. But most of this talk is going to be focused on, there's going to be a lot of overlap between topics in that book and the data here, but I'm mainly talking about what we did with our systematic review once we get into that middle part. So the first thing to discuss is what are highs themselves. So human-animal interactions themselves are, sorry, let me move some of this, involve the study of all forms of contact animals have with people. So we're talking about something that's been studied across a number of different settings, livestock interactions, companion animals, including things like animal-assisted therapies. Paul Hemsworth out at University of Melbourne has studied human-animal interactions in the form of livestock interactions with cattle. And then, of course, zoos. So in zoos, we have a few decades of research in this area. Actually, the first real publication was in the late 80s. I'll talk a little bit about that when I start showing the data. In zoos, they're typically studied as animal-visitor interactions. So although we can talk about interactions with staff as well. So there are, and that's one of the chapters we actually have in our book. For the data that I'm showing you here, I'm mainly focused on animal-visitor interactions. So that's what we're going to focus on here. And then AVIs themselves are usually studied as either the impact of the visitor on animals, so what's called the visitor effect, or the impact of animals on the visitors or the visitor experience. So again, within AVIs, visitor effects and visitor experiences have very specific definitions. So the visitor experience within AVIs just refers to the effect, the impact itself of the animals on the visitors. We could talk more generally about visitor experiences. So what happens to a visitor at the zoo? We could also talk more generally about visitor effects, right? So what impact visitors have on other visitors, on staff, etc. But within AVIs, these are the definitions for visitor effects and visitor experiences that we're talking specifically between that interaction between the animal and the visitor. So here's some visuals. This actually comes from Keith and Guy's presentation they gave on this topic. It's a lovely little animation that they did to show you the differences of visitor effects versus visitor experiences within AVIs. So if we think about visitor effects, again, visitors can have that impact on an animal. That can be a positive effect. It can also be a negative effect. So We can see detriment to the welfare, or we can see a potential benefit to the welfare as a result of the interaction. By the same token, we can say the same thing about visitor experiences. People can see an animal and have a positive experience. They can interact with an animal in some way, directly or indirectly, and have a positive experience, or they can have a potential negative experience. So in both cases, we can talk about positive and negative effects as well as neutral effects as well. So there's more generally neutral effects. Now, in the last few decades, there's been a lot of research in this topic. So it's become one of the most researched topics in zoos. The only thing I know of that's researched more in zoos is the field of environmental enrichment. And I'll show you a bit about what some of that growth really looks like over the last, particularly the last few years. Now, historically, when there's also been 8 or 9 reviews on this topic, something like that at this point, and now a book. What most of the reviews up until now have shown is that most of what's studied is just the visitor effect. Historically, there have been some recent reviews. I've been involved in both of those on visitor experience, but not a lot of focus. It's on visitor experiences within AVIs, mostly on the visitor effect. And historically, of those visitor effect studies, most of it is focused on negative visitor effects on primates. So there are some more recent reviews. In fact, Ellen Williams and her colleagues showed that there was an increase in non-primate studies. Again, part of what why we wanted to do this systematic review was we wanted to get a more general idea of what was happening. Also because other papers, for instance, Sherwin and Hemsworth, 2019, talked about the fact that there are positive interactions to be had. So I'll end up showing you what some of that data looks like, what we know now based on this systematic review, the first systematic review in this area. So, and then a last point to be made about animal visitor interactions in zoos. De Cruz et al. Talked a bit about direct versus indirect interactions. And one of the things that he showed based on his data was that most zoos around the world had some form of direct interaction at a zoo. So this was fairly commonplace. Again, historically, people have said you want to limit the interactions, particularly direct interactions people have with the animals in any exhibit. So now we've seen a bit of a change. It seems like that's starting to change, but again, we need the data. What does a systematic review tell us about some of these things? So again, this paper, it's under review actually currently with Zoo Biology. It's the first systematic review of animal visitor interactions. Oh, if you've come in, if you want to go ahead and pause, sorry, if you want to mute yourself, that'd be great. So we looked at all studies claiming to be an AVI, ended up being 151 papers. Actually, we updated this at the beginning of 2024. So there's 157 papers, I think now, 314 studies. I'll talk a little bit about that difference between a study and a paper here in a bit. And we compared changes, so the changes over time. How have AVI studies really been changing over the last few decades? And we predicted a few things, that there would be an increase in AVI studies. We predicted increases in both visitor experience and effect studies, not just visitor effects. We also said that with respect to visitor effect studies, that we expected an increase in non-primate species studied, and also an increase in positive effects recorded, so that more positive welfare effects for the animals would be recorded as a result of some interaction. So that said, let's get into the actual data. Let me show you what the data actually looks like, what we had from this 150 plus papers. Now, this is actually, so 1987, in fact, it's a Hosey Chomov paper, Hosey et al., 1987, actually, I should say it was, I think, 86 or 87, the first paper. And that paper itself gives you a good example of the difference between what we're talking about here in terms of papers and studies. Because in that very first paper, what they had, it's one paper published in 86 or 87, but it had 11 different species of primates studied in the paper. So that's the difference between a paper and a study. A paper is the actual publication, whereas a study means the number of experiments, the number of observations, usually the number of species studied. So they went and observed multiple studies. So that's why you see that big blip where it's 11 for that 1986-87, that first dot there. It's only one paper, that blue circle, but then you see about 11 different primate species studied. And what you can see, what's really interesting, is this late surge right around 2019. So the last 4 years, quite a big bump in both papers and studies in the number. So the number of papers published in ABIs, it's a massive increase, ended up being almost half of all the papers published in ABIs have been published in the last 4 years, between 2019 and 2023. So we don't know what the 2024 numbers will look like, but that's pretty massive. Now, Ellen Williams showed this in the Williams et al. Paper 2023, and they suggested that the surge might be due to COVID, but we looked more specifically at that. And this is what our numbers actually, so in that period of time when COVID was occurring, it turned out that not quite as many, about half, a little less than half the papers were related to COVID, or sorry, I should say much less than half, about a third or so to a quarter of the papers. So what you can see there in 2020, that count was 20 of the papers unrelated to COVID, not surprisingly, because COVID just started in 2020. But in 2021, we see about 2/3 of the paper were involved animals studied outside of the COVID period of time, so unrelated to COVID. It was only 2022 where we saw about half the papers were done during COVID and the other half not during COVID. So what Williams had stated, that the big surge was potentially due to COVID, turned out to not exactly be correct. What it looks like probably happened is that a lot of people had data and they had more time to publish during COVID rather than necessarily do the studies. Certainly, the ability to do studies during COVID also, there was that bump up in that, and that helped contribute to the number. But the majority of studies were not done during COVID. So it was more likely a result of having that time to publish. Okay, so in terms of the second key finding, turns out most of the increase was due to visitor effects studies. We do see that slow tick up in visitor experience studies, but nowhere near the majority of the studies published, especially in that 2019 to 2023 period of time, were in fact visitor effects studies. So, and just doing some chi-squares, we do see certainly a difference in both papers and studies that the majority of research done in animal visitor interaction research is visitor effects, is based on visitor effects itself. So it's the vast majority of it. Close to 90%, 88.7% of all papers and 88.5% of all studies. So the vast majority, almost 90% of all studies are visitor effects studies. So the first visitor experience study was actually in 2003. And we've seen a marked increase in 2020, but otherwise, again, the majority, so we saw 10 studies in 2020 that took into account visitor experiences, but still the majority of research in AVIs focuses on visitor effects. So the last few key findings that I'll talk about here are with respect to those visitor effects. So again, keeping in mind that visitor effects are the effect of visitors being present, indirect or direct, on the animals studied. And remember, I mentioned that the majority of research to begin with were primate focused. So, and that's what you're seeing here on the top graph. There is the count. The bottom is percentage. And what you see is that almost all the research up until about 2011 or so was with primates. And then we see a big switch. So the majority, there's significantly more non-primate studies overall. So we do see a big switch. The majority of studies now is over 65% is non-primate studies. But that's because of this big bump that you see here in the last few years, where most of what's being studied now is non-primates. Until about 2011 or so, it was almost exclusively primates. So we've seen a big flipping of who the subjects are in these studies, which I think is great. I think it certainly, we want to see continued research in the effects of visitors on primates, but there's a lot more species at the zoo than primates. So it's great to see a big focus on that. And if we look at who those classes of animals are, the majority of it is still mammals, almost 80%. So even though it's not primates, it's still, the majority of it is still mammals. But we do see a rise in some of these other species, in some of these other classes of animals, including birds, over 10%. Reptiles, there's now 6 papers, I think, on reptiles published, looking at the effects of visitors on their welfare, which is great. So that's 6 papers, 5 or 6 papers with 10, that N right there is number of studies. So 10 studies on reptiles that cover 5 or 6 papers. Amphibians, I think that's only 1 or 2 amphibian papers that produce those 6 studies. And then fish is just down at 5 studies. So, but we are seeing a little bit of diversity. I'd like to see more diversity in the classes of animals studied, but I think we'll get there. Okay, so the last prediction we had, the last key finding, is what about that focus on negative versus positive visitor effects on the welfare of the animals? What you see, again, count in the top graph, and then percentage down at the bottom graph. And everything up until, I think it was just around 2009, 2010 or so, everything was a negative visitor effect that was studied. And what we're now starting to see is this switch. It's not flipping. Still, the majority of research is focused on negative visitor effects, but we are seeing a slow increase in the rise of studying positive visitor effects. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, Neil DeCruz et al., 2019, 2020, showed that most zoos around the world involved not just indirect, because indirect interactions, you can't prevent those. And I'll give you a little brief operational definition of both, but involve direct interactions. So what DeCruz et al. Called an indirect versus a direct interaction is whether there was contact with the animal. So if you did a public feeding with a giraffe or an elephant, like the paper I published a few years ago, that would be a direct interaction. If you had some type of hands-on experience with an animal ambassador, those would be if you went into a petting zoo and pet a goat or a sheep or something. Those are all direct interactions. The indirect interactions are the things that are happening where there's some effect, but there's some barrier between the visitor and the animal itself. So as DeCruz pointed out, most zoos around the world involve some type of direct interaction with some of their animals. So it's good that we're starting to see more demonstration of positive welfare effects as a result of those interactions, because if the animals are going to be involved in those interactions, we should hope that it benefits not just the visitor, but the animal in some way, that there should be some rewarding experience involved. So overall, from our systematic review, again, this is under review with Zoo Biology. It's been under review with them for a few months, so hopefully we'll hear back soon. I'm hoping it's accepted and we get it published in the not so distant future. But what we do see is there are increases in both visitor experience studies and visitor effects, but the majority of papers still published are focused on visitor effects within animal-visitor interactions. The majority of the taxa are now non-primate. We started out with just primate species, and now we're seeing a lot more non-primate species, which is great. And we are seeing still the majority of effects observed are negative visitor effects on the welfare of the animals, but we are seeing an increase in studying positive welfare effects. So that's great. All of these things, we're seeing some positive trends. So just to give you an example, sorry, can you mute your mic if you're there? Just mute your mic. So perfect, thank you. I'm going to show you one study that shows a positive effect of visitors through a direct interaction on the animals themselves. So, and this was a paper we published a few years ago, a study we did with Woodland Park Zoo that involved public feeding as enrichment. So public feeding interaction as enrichment for the elephants. And what we had was 3 elephants at Woodland Park Zoo in Seattle were trained to interact with visitors during a public feeding. So Watoto, these were 3 female elephants, they had been at the zoo for almost half a century. Watoto was an African female elephant, Chai and Bamboo were Asian elephants. That itself made it a little odd. It's just that they grew up together. They'd all been at the zoo at least since the, I think, early 90s. Bamboo and Watoto had been there since the late 70s, early 80s, something like that. So they were just housed at that time together. And because elephants form pretty tight social bonds, they just ended up keeping the mixed species together like that. So the public feeding itself functioned as a direct human-animal interaction or animal-visitor interaction. And what we wanted to know was, does being fed by visitors have some type of enriching effect? Of the handful of studies, there's something like half a dozen studies now published on public feeding interactions. Up until this paper, there had been no studies published on any type of enriching effect. There were a couple studies published that showed that there was no adverse effect of a public feeding interaction, one of those being with lemurs, but no real beneficial effect of the public feeding interaction. So that was part of what we wanted to see, if there was in fact a potential welfare benefit to the elephants. So in other words, is there a positive visitor effect for the elephants from a public feeding event? So what we did was we looked at public feeding versus no public feeding days. Those were the two conditions we measured. I'll answer some questions just at the end here. So, sorry, I just saw those questions. 3 periods that we looked at as well, before, during, and after a public feeding. That's what the public feedings looked like on the left. We had 6 classes of behavior measured. So those are the 6 general classes of behavior. So this is an important part, I guess I should say as well. I'll show you the last bit of these procedural details. They were 5-minute sessions that we took 7 days a week for almost half a year. We had about 130 hours of observation, about 1,500 sessions. One thing that is worth noting, because I was out giving some presentations to Singapore Zoo a few months ago, and they did public feeding interactions with their elephants, and we're trying to model some of the stuff we did in our paper, except they were running into difficulties with the public and doing the public feeding and the interactions. But they actually had the public handing the food directly to the elephant, so the elephant could reach over, grab it from the person, which also meant the person had a bit of control themselves over whether the elephant did or didn't get the food, and they might pull back or reach out. And what we did here, what Woodland Park Zoo did, I should be specific here, was what they had was, this is a bamboo that would be inside these pipes, inside these poles, so that once the elephant, there was no direct contact itself between the person and the elephant. It would still be labeled a direct interaction, but there was no direct contact between the person and the elephant, because once the elephant grabbed the leaves, it could just pull the entire leaves and sticks out of the pole, and the person couldn't take it away. So it didn't suffer the potential risk of an elephant grabbing a person or pulling the person into the exhibit by the branch or something like that. So, and that ended up being, I think, very beneficial. It's one of the things I suggested to Singapore Zoo to change with their procedure. So this is what the data looked like. This is public feeding to no public feeding. So the no public feeding, no PF there is the dark green, what you're seeing there. And then the striped lighter green is the public feeding. The 3 elephants there, Bamboo, Chai, and Watoto, Watoto being the African elephant on the bottom. What you're actually seeing is 2 elephants increase social behaviors during the public feeding. So they were in fact interacting with not just the people, but with each other. So that's what most of those interactions end up being, is their interactions with each other. 2 of the elephants decreased stereotypies during the public feeding, which is a good thing. And Watoto increased foraging during the public feeding. So all indications of positive welfare. However, if you look at what's happening with Bamboo, you see a decrease in foraging behavior. And although there's that increase in social, there's also an increase in inactivity. So a decrease in foraging and an increase in inactivity here is a potential negative effect, right? So we wanted to know what was happening with Bamboo. So to understand that, that's just stating what I said there. We looked at what happened on the days that there was a public feeding and compared before, during, and after a public feeding. And so we looked at those differences and we compared them to baseline levels. So that's what this next graph will show you here. So what you're seeing is baseline level for that same time during a non-public feed. So again, bamboo up top, chai in the middle, watoto on the bottom. So for instance, if you see this large change in watoto in the after condition down here, I'm pointing my arrow down over here, large increase in foraging behavior there. That means in this case, during the public or in the after period for the public feeding, that there was a significant increase in foraging for watoto compared to the same time when there wasn't a public feeding. So that's the change from baseline. And what you actually see in bamboo, which is the main elephant of interest here, is that bamboo showed a decrease in foraging during and then an increase afterwards. All three of the elephants showed increases in foraging after a public feeding. They would get most of their food after the public feeding. Bamboo showed that increase as well. What you actually saw was an increase in social behavior during the public feeding, and then that increase in activity was afterwards. So what bamboo was actually doing was bamboo was so interested in the interactions with the visitor that bamboo wasn't eating their food and was simply waiting for an interaction with a visitor. So standing still and waiting for the interaction. And bamboo would save all of their food that they would get from the visitors. They were really just coming over to interact with the visitor and then eat the food afterward. And all the elephants were doing that, but bamboo was the one in particular that showed the greatest increase in social interactions and a big decrease in inactivity as well afterward. So bamboo was mostly there to interact with the visitors, which was very interesting. So that's just reiterating what I was saying there. I forgot to pop those up while I was talking. So the public feeding actually increased foraging activity after the event for all three of the elephants, and that's important as well. So just to summarize, before I show you one last little study, because I want to show you some seal research as well, paper we published just a couple years ago. It did appear that there was an enriching effect from the public feeding interaction for all three elephants. And it took a little bit of nuanced detail. It took a little bit of understanding how those interactions worked to see that effect for all three elephants, for bamboo in particular. But this was the first evidence of a public feeding having an enriching effect for the animal. So really a win-win for the animals and the visitors, so for the zoo in general. So visitors get a lovely experience and the animals seem to be enriched by that interaction. Now, this last paper, we published this last year, Northey et al. So Emily Northey, this was her master's thesis. I'm just going to show you part of the data here. What we actually looked at was this was Seattle Aquarium. We had a couple harbor seals and one northern fur seal at the aquarium. And both of those exhibits were getting a new addition. So those are the 3 harbor seals. So one of those was the new harbor seal that was added to the exhibit. And in the bottom left, there's the 2 northern fur seals. One of those was the new northern fur seal that was added to the exhibit. They, very little, surprisingly, very little quantitatively done to study the effects of introductions of animals to an exhibit. But nothing done up until Emily's paper on the effects of those introductions on not just the animal, but on the visitors. So we wanted to see what effect that had. So we studied both of these exhibits, and I'm only going to show you the northern fur seal data. If you go to the paper, you can see the harbor seal data as well. No insult to the harbor seals. They are just as adorable as northern fur seals. But I want to show you some of the really interesting data from what we got in this study in terms of what effect it had on the visitors as well. So that was the big thing that we wanted to look at, not just the effect of introducing a new animal, new harbor seal, a new fur seal on the existing animals, but also what effect did that have on the visitors. So what we did, there's a lovely little harbor seal up in the top right there. There's almost nothing more adorable than seeing a harbor seal blink. So if you ever get to see harbor seals in the wild, I've had the fortune of being able to watch them out in the wild quite a few times. Just wait for that blink. It is honestly one of the greatest events in life ever, is just watching a harbor seal blink. So I might be a little biased though. So there's two conditions we looked at before and after new seal introductions. We had two experiments, the harbor seals. As I mentioned, I'm not going to talk about that experiment one. You're more than welcome to go look at the paper. Paper's open access too. Anybody can get access to it. I'm just going to focus on experiment two. We had 5 different behaviors, classes of behaviors we looked at, 15 behaviors split into those 5 classes. And we had 1 hour observation sessions that we looked at. So quite a lot of sessions that we had, 4 months of data that we looked at. And we had almost 100 hours for experiment 1, and then over 100 hours, almost 120 hours for experiment 2 for the fur seals. So again, I'm just going to show you some of the fur seal data here. Now, this was our existing fur seal here, northern fur seal, Flaherty. He was a 9-year-old male. And then that's Chai, we just called him Chai. Chidax was the 8-year-old male who was introduced. That is, in fact, what northern fur seals look like. If you haven't seen fur seals before, you're probably looking at them and saying, they look like a sea lion. Well, they're in the same family as sea lions in general. So they are the, I just blanked on the family itself, the order Pinnipeds, and there's 3 different families. So the walruses, the Odobenidae, are the walruses, then the harbor seals and the other earless seals are Phocidae or Phocidae. And I will eventually remember it. I feel so bad. In fact, Kelly, who's in the audience, is probably hating on me for not remember. Kelly, you unmuted.
Eduardo, it's Otaridae.
There we go. Thank you. So there's the family, and that's the fur seals and sea lions. That's why they look similar. I always think the fur seals in general look a little bit more cartoonish than sea lions. And certainly Chai is living up to that there on the right. So we introduced Chai to this solo house, to Flaherty, the solo house seal there. And what we actually saw for the fur seal, for the effect there, was, not surprisingly, an increase in social behavior and then a reduction in stereotypies. That reduction is the important part. So post-introduction, Flaherty was more social. Well, he had somebody he could be social with. So, the effect was friend. That's really what that effect was. So, but he also spent less time circle swimming, which was important. So increasing those social interactions, and what that meant was there was an increase in activity and a decrease in inactivity. It just wasn't statistically significant. So, but the decrease in stereotypies was. And when you looked at their activity budgets in general, this is what they looked like. after introduction. So this is just their behavior while both of them were present. The majority of what they're doing is active behavior, very little stereotypies for either of them, very little out of sight. So that's great. And the younger seal, he's a year younger, Chai, he was more active and thus less inactive. So now here's the interesting part. Let me show you the next bit here. What happened as a result? How did the visitors respond to the introduction of a new seal? There's now 2 seals to observe instead of 1 seal. We're also, the main effect here likely is due to the activity that we've seen an increase of, the general reduction in stereotypies. How does that affect visitors? It's a bit of a treatment package there. Because there is multiple seals and also changes in their activity. But what we actually see is, so the crowd size, the number of individuals significantly increased post-introduction. So there were more people in front of the seal exhibit. It was a greater crowd size, more number of individuals, more visitors in front of the exhibit when there were both the seals present and both of them being more active. So that's great. And then this latter, the number of minutes, so we would sample an individual that came into the exhibit and watch how long they stayed at the exhibit for. So that's the visitor length of stay. And that approached significance. It almost doubled in time from just over a minute to just over 2 minutes on average. Unfortunately, it wasn't statistically significant. There was quite a bit of variability there, which helped play into it not being significant, but it approached significance, which itself was relevant. So, as I mentioned, went from just over a minute to just over 2 minutes, how long people would stay in front of the exhibit, which is also important. So, overall seemed to have a positive visitor effect as well. So, or positive, I should say, visitor experience in this sense. So a positive visitor effect and visitor experience. Positive visitor experience in the fact that larger crowd sizes and larger number of individuals. We don't know anything other than at a correlational level what effect those had on each other. So all we can say is that our experimental variable was this, and these 2 things increased. Did one cause the other to increase? We don't know. How did that contribute? We don't know. But we do know that both increased as a result of the introduction of the animal. So changes in the seal behavior, changes in the visitor behavior. Okay, so the last little bit I'll talk about here, and then we can get to any questions. Future directions for AVIs. I think one of the most critical things is that, and that last point I was making about what we see in terms of correlations, the vast majority of AVI research is correlational. The vast majority of it is. And unfortunately, what ends up happening, there are quite a number of examples of AVI research where people assume that one increase causes the increase in the other. But if it's only correlational, we don't know the causal direction. We don't know if there is a causal effect. So we need better experiments. There are a few studies that have done some experiments. For instance, Chu et al. Did some things with limiting visitor presence for little penguins at Melbourne Zoo. So Sam Chu and colleagues did that. O'Malley et al. Done at Brookfield Zoo with Lance Miller. Covered up windows to see if that had an effect on gorilla behavior. So in both those cases, they're experimentally manipulating a variable there and seeing what effect it has then on the animals themselves. So that's what we need a lot more of. We also, I think, need better visitor experience studies. We need a greater emphasis on visitor experiences in general. almost just above 10% of all AVI studies are visitor experiences. I think that's pretty limited. So we need to know what effects observing animals having, whether it's an indirect or direct interaction, what effect does that have on visitors? The majority of visitor studies, and that's usually what this area is called, is visitor studies, doesn't look at what involvement an interaction has. So it's not a visitor experience within an AVI study. And most of it is survey based. Very little of it is behavioral. So we need more studies. We need experimental studies on this topic as well. So what effect does being able to view animals or not view animals under some experimental condition, what effect does that have on visitors itself? So that's important for educational and keeping the doors open purposes. Zoos need visitors to be there. So hopefully it has a beneficial effect for the animals, for conservation, and for some learning experience for the visitor. That's what we hope, but we can't assume those things. So we need more research in this topic. And that should include external non-AVI factors as well, and how those influence interactions. For instance, we published a study just last year looking at the effects of signage and staff on visitor behavior. So how does that work with it? How does signage interact with animal visitor interactions? We know almost nothing. So we need more research in this area. And then finally, we need more studies of and demonstrations of positive interactions, positive visitor effects. What that particularly for visitor effects, where there is some positive welfare effect on the animal. Again, historically, most research is focused on negative visitor effects on zoo primates, and now we see that most research is non-primates. We see increases in visitor experiences, so it would be nice to demonstrate those positive visitor experience effects or positive visitor experiences in general, and the positive visitor effects on the animals. I think we need more of that, particularly for non-primate species. There's some more studies being done in this area. I think we'll see much more published in the near future. And we know that direct interactions are happening across zoos around the world, that almost all zoos around the world have some type of direct interaction. And then we know that the indirect interactions are going to be there. If an animal is on exhibit, it's almost impossible to remove the impact of a visitor. So why not look for ways to make that a positive visitor interaction for a positive visitor effect as a result? So yeah, our focus should be on increasing positive highs in zoos and aquariums. And the book, I'll show you a little, the thing here for the book here, the book that Sally Sherwin and I just published, spends a lot of time talking about those potential positive visitor effects and positive visitor experiences. So that said, thank you. Here's just some basic information about me. If you want to follow or friend me on Facebook, if you want to follow me on ResearchGate, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, lots of stuff there. And I'll show you the references just here in a second. I'll come back to this. So here's the references within the presentation. And I wanted to show, this is the book published. There's the actual link. I can post that link in the chat as well. But for anybody that's watching this via video, that will be there for you to be able to go and click on, and that's the book itself. So I'll go ahead and stop the presentation, and then we can see if there's any questions.